Hey friends, just coming back to you from the middle of the day in my house, with my kids, my dog. We're jumping into part 2 of our Lightroom series where we're going to be looking at our 5 favorite Lightroom tools. In our first part, our intro, we went through everything there is in Lightroom and there's a ton of functionality. So today we're going to narrow our focus and just talk about our 5 favorite tools and why we use them for everything.
Is there anything else I can do before I leave?
Nope, good, thanks. All right, it's just you and me now. Let's go. And so today we're talking about back office stuff. We're talking about photo editing. We're talking about Lightroom. We're not just talking about Lightroom in general though, because there's so much to it. So today we're just gonna be talking about our 5 favorite tools in Lightroom. And so very simply, they are the tone curve. They are the various things you have for exposure balancing. They're the HSL sliders and calibration. They're cropping, and then there are the local adjustment tools. So we'll be going through each of those in depth. Y'all ready? Let's go. We usually start with exposure balancing first. That's our favorite tool. And so how you do that is using the exposure to lighten the photo, but now you can see that it almost creates too high of highlights up here, but the photo as a whole still feels a little bit dark to me. And so we'll use the highlights slider to bring down some of those whites. We can also use the white slider to bring down some of those. And we can also bring up the shadows a little bit to just create a little bit more of an evenly exposed photo. And so now it looks like we have a bit more of an evenly exposed photo as a whole, but it looks a little bit flat to me. The next thing that we're going to do is use our contrast slider to bump up the contrast just a bit. But the one thing about contrast, if you go too far, it also affects the color. It saturates the colors in a photo. And so we try not to use the contrast too much. We will bump up the contrast a little bit, but really to kind of get a bit more kind of pop or crispness in this photo, the other tool that we love to use is the clarity tool. Clarity helps bring contrast to the larger details of a photo, but doesn't overly accentuate blemishes or imperfections in people's skin. So this photo looks a little bit better to me now. Using some of these tools in here, I feel like we've taken our original photo and created a much more of a exposed photo. Our next favorite tool is the tone curve. And the tone curve allows you to really do a lot more here with a photo. So what's happening with the tone curve, as we talk about in our intro video, is it really adjusts kind of the different regions of your photo. You've got the blacks here on the left into the midtones and then fading into the highlights and the whites here on the far right. So if you see, as if I bring down the whites, it basically just clips off some of those whites in the photo. We don't have a whole lot, so it's hard to see the real effect. Similarly, if I go down here, that'll clip some of the blacks in the photos. So that'll give it more, it'll kind of fade the blacks. But you can also put points in the middle of this to maybe bring down the shadows a little bit, bring up the highlights a little bit, and that's just another way to kind of produce a little bit more contrast in your photo. And so this is a way to kind of adjust that without overly affecting the color. What's really interesting about the tone curve though is that you can not only do it for the overall highlights and shadows in the photos, but you can do it for the individual color combinations. So I can take the reds specifically, and I can isolate those, and I can affect the tone of the highlights. So that makes them a little bit more like red, but the opposite of red is green. And so if I take them down, it'll make the whole photo a bit more green. If you take the green channel though, it's kind of the opposite. You bring up the greens, you get more green. You take them down, you get more red. So it's really just the inverse of that green tone. And then you can use the blue, and this will make things more blue as you go up and more yellow as you come down. Opposite of the blue is yellow. So that's the tone curve. That was our second favorite tool. Third favorite tool is the HSL or color sliders. And so what you can do is you can affect the hue, saturation, and luminance of every color individually. So if I want to tone down this pink here, for example, I'm guessing that's going to be controlled by magenta, so I can make it more red, or I can make it really like hot pink. Another cool thing you can do here is you can click on the color. You can use this selector tool to click on the color that you want to influence, and it'll automatically adjust the various colors in the photo that influence that particular tone that you selected. So you can see it's primarily driven by magenta with a little bit of red. Saturation is the same kind of deal. If you wanted to cut this pink down a little bit, you could take the saturation down, and then I might also want to bring up just the luminance on their skin. So a really cool thing that you can do with luminance is skin tones are normally primarily controlled by orange and red. And so you can really isolate skin tones and bring up just the exposure of the skin tones using the luminance. So it's a great way to like brighten people's faces without having to use a lot of local adjustments and without blowing out like their clothes or things like that, which is super, super cool. The fourth thing is cropping. And so this photo, we don't really need to do a lot of cropping, but let's hop over to a different one where you have a horizon line, so it's a little bit more obvious how we want to crop this photo, whether it looks crooked or whether it actually looks straight. How do we do that when it's kind of hard to tell what's straight in this photo? When you click on the side, I guess, to rotate a photo, these grid lines appear, and those are super helpful to help you identify how straight am I in comparison to a horizon line, for example. So cropping is one of our favorite tools. We use it on tons of photos, and when you're moving fast, your photos are hardly ever straight, so it really helps. The last tool is actually a collection of tools that we really love, and it is these local adjustments. So if I actually reset this photo to the original photo, you can see there's really dark shadows down here, but really bright highlights here. So okay, how are we going to deal with that? There's a couple great tools here that we can use. Okay, so a little bit closer here. I don't want to blow out the highlights, but I've still got pretty dark shadows down here, and they don't really pop to me. My couple doesn't really pop. I've also got this tree here, which looks a little distracting. So I want to do something about all this stuff. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to get rid of the tree. And let's look at how you do that. So this right here is a spot removal tool, and it is super, super helpful. So basically what it does is you can highlight over something you want to remove from a photo or replace, and it will automatically select a different part of your photo that it thinks will stitch together well with what you're trying to replace and be relatively seamless. So if you look at that, man, it did a pretty good job. Like, that's pretty good. Let's be honest. I'm happy with it. A couple things about the spot removal tool, though, is you have two options. You have a heal option, which really tries to stitch things together super well, so you can't really tell where the boundary is. But you also do have this clone option, which will really just kind of copy paste a different part of the photo and stamp it, in this spot that you're trying to replace. And that can be super helpful if you're trying to do really fine spot removals. But for the most part, heal works really well. So that's spot removal. Graduated filter. This is super helpful because it can apply a linear change to a photo. This is your midpoint, and then this is your transition zone between these two other lines. And so you can change that transition zone. We like to keep it pretty big so that you can't really tell where it starts and where it stops. So what I want to do is I want to bring down the sky a little bit. I'm going to be able to take some of those highlights down a little more. So that adjusts the sky, but I'm still really shadowy down here. But the good thing is this is a perfect place for another graduated filter. So I'm going to put another one here that basically does the opposite. And there we go. It's a little bit more well balanced. And yet still, I feel like this couple doesn't really pop to me. And so this is where we're going to use our last tool, which is the local adjustment brush. The cool thing about the local adjustment brush is that you can do all these things with the brush, but it basically just paints these modifications only where you painted your brush on the photo. And so I can bring up the exposure on them to where they really pop from this grass without losing the depth of color and texture in the grass itself. The one other thing we have here is we have this radial filter, and this actually could be really useful for, you can see how we have a little bit of vignetting around the edge of this photo. If I wanted to, for example, if I wanted to get rid of that, I could center this radial filter right there. I could take up the exposure which basically just affects the outside of this filter like that, and it'll bring up those edges so that they aren't quite so dark. So those were our 5 favorite tools for Lightroom. Leave us a comment if there was something that really worked for you, super exciting for you. If you have any more questions, let us know what your favorite tools are in Lightroom. And we just love to engage because we want to help you grow in confidence. And so any guidance and support that we can provide to help you get there, we are super excited about. So stay tuned for our next video, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.